Greetings, greetings. You are listening to the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show podcast, and I'm your host, Chris A. Matthews, and I am excited about our guest today. We have Dr. Candice Cooper-Lovett joining us. She has a PhD in couples and family therapy from Drexel University. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified sex therapist, approved supervisor for the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapists, and owner of a new creation psychotherapy services and the Tantric MFT. Dr. Cooper-Lovett, thank you for being on the show.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to today.
Awesome. Well, we're going to have a lot of fun and help some listeners out as well.
Absolutely.
Always like to start with this question, especially when I have a marriage and family therapist, one of color as well. What got you into this field? Because it's not a lot of us that do this work with that particular credential.
Absolutely. So it was for a couple of reasons. So I knew I wanted to be an MFT when I was in my senior year of college, actually, because I was applying to grad school. I was a part of the McNair Scholars Program. So it was for students who want to eventually get their doctorates. And so it forced me to have to look up, okay, what programs or type of under the branch of psychology, where did I want to go into? So I knew that I wanted to be a sex therapist since high school. So, and when I reached out to ASAC back then, they were like, well, the best avenue is to do the marriage and family therapy track because there wasn't as many training programs back then. That was back in 2004, 2005. So, they had me do that. And so I was like, okay, that's one avenue. The second one was, at the time, I have a very strong passion and dedication for those in trauma, families, individuals, as it relates to domestic violence and sexual abuse and assault. So I knew that I wanted to work with those types of families as well at the time. Still do to some degree, but it's broadened and expanded itself since then.
Man, I'm so glad that you shared your story. And you talked about a couple of things I want to process. First, with the domestic violence, if I recall correctly, 1 out of every 3 women in their lifetime will be a victim. Is that accurate?
Yep, and 1 out of every 7 men as well, which is a hidden population that people don't address a lot, and men don't have a safe space to share that either.
Absolutely. And then when you talk about becoming a certified sex therapist, as we know on Instagram and social media, everybody want to talk about sex, but not that many people want to talk about it from a credentialed stance. So can you share just a couple of tidbits or facts or whatever you think that'll be helpful, because so many people are talking about sex on social media sites, but we actually have today a certified sex therapist, right? Yes, so what do couples need to know about sex when it comes to keeping the relationship together?
Yeah, definitely. What they need to know is that it's not just about sex, right? And then I always ask, when couples come to me saying we're not being intimate, I always ask in what way, because there are at least 13, 14 different ways to be intimate.
Wow.
Yeah. Emotional.
13, 14. Okay.
At least. So, and I did a TikTok a while ago on the different types of intimacy. So, you got the emotional, aesthetic, recreational, social, spiritual, I can keep going down that list. Even crisis and moments of difficult times and how we come together as a couple through a crisis. So sex is one slice of the pie, most definitely. And it's one of those things, how I see it is that when it's there, it's like the cherry on top of a sundae, but when it's not there, it kind of takes up the whole sundae. It's one of those things that's weird like that. But, as it relates to marital satisfaction, but it's so much more broader and much bigger than just sex itself.
Yeah, and that was really profound. It's the cherry on top of the sundae when it's there, but when it's not there, it takes up the whole sundae.
Yes.
And you also talked about intimacy being more than just sex. And I know in your work, I'm sure you see this. When couples mention the word intimacy, do you find that they're always kind of alluding to sex, or do you pretty much it's usually about sex? Now, discuss with us ways. And I'm asking from a male perspective. A lot of the men I counsel with their wives or girlfriends will come in. And usually when a man initiates counseling, it's for 2 reasons that I find most common. One, he cheated and he's attempting to repair the relationship. Or 2, he's not getting the amount or the type of sex he desires, right? Yep. Those are pretty much 2 reasons why men seek out counseling.
Yes. Now, and there are times where she has stepped out, but that's those times. But women typically, they're a little more strategic.
Absolutely. And when these men call, let's go with the latter that is seeking to speak about sex, do you find that it's more around frequency, type, both? Give us some insight on what you find men are typically wanting or seeking more of in the bedroom.
Yeah, definitely. So what I'm finding is that for men particularly has to do with frequency, and it has to do with some men quality and connection.
Okay.
But what I recognize, there is a huge pleasure gap between men and women. Women check out a lot and disassociate during sex because they're not being pleasured. So hence the lack of frequency, or the lack of connection. So like somebody told me a while ago, is like driving on cruise control. It's just kind of, not intense or passionate, or it's just kind of just there. It's like, okay, this cool, but it's not that sense of connection there.
Well, let's go deep into that for a second, right? Because a lot of men, especially if they are unable to check their ego, may not be willing to hear
Hmm.
that their partner is unsatisfied. But what I'm hearing you say is satisfaction in the bedroom may lead to a lack of frequency because the female partner is not getting pleased. Talk about how you help men. If you were to give 3 tips that men
Absolutely.
could apply, and I know all men and women are different, so I don't want to assume
Exactly.
these tips would apply to every female, but
Yeah.
what are some things that men could do holistically to attempt to increase the type of frequency or the amount of frequency they're providing their partner?
Sure, definitely.
And
So
I didn't mean to say frequency. I'm sorry. I meant
I
gratification.
gratification. Gotcha. Yes. So I tell it's twofold, right? So for women, we have to learn to be responsible for our own pleasure.
Mm.
That's number one. Secondly, we need to learn how to master our own pleasure, because a lot of us are not in tune with ourselves to have relationships with our sexual or sensual selves to even express to a partner what we need. So if we know these things and master to a level where we are supposed to, we don't even have to share with our partner what we need. They already just know. You know what I mean? But that's on a whole other level of connection. So for men, it's also tapping into not just the sexual, but the sensual. Men like to skip the sensual part,
Get
you
right to it.
know,
Yeah.
whereas women, we need the sensual to connect. Men need it too, whether they, when they're really connected.
Right.
So I feel like it's just having that genuine connection, women connecting to themselves, men slowing down, because that's a big thing. Foreplay is a part of sex. Foreplay should not be 2 minutes and we go on to penetration. I'm speaking to heterosexual couples,
Mhm.
but it needs to be a process.
Gotcha. So slowing down and creating a process and experience. Now, I want to go back to something you just said about women being responsible for their own pleasure. It sounded like the responsibility was being shifted a little bit. So talk about that more for
Yeah,
us.
when it relates to women and pleasure, oftentimes women blame their male partners for
Hmm.
that lack of pleasure. But is she being transparent? Is she sharing with him that she's not pleased? Those are the parts where she's responsible for. It's my responsibility to share that with my partner. And then he has his part. So once I let you know what I like and what I dislike, and you do the opposite anyway, now I can hold you accountable. But I can't hold my partner accountable for something that they don't know.
Gotcha. Now, when you talk about being responsible and sharing what you need, you have to first understand those needs for yourself before you communicate them to someone else. What about partners that may have biological concerns? And when you think about all of the TV ads now, Viagra, or you
Mhm.
have all these commercial hymns, all these different platforms of media or telling men all you have to do is get an erection. If you have the erection, then everything's going to work itself out. So
Yeah.
go into the biology components of what you find as a certified sex therapist.
Yeah, so definitely. And first and foremost, they focus too much around or center too much around male performance and male pleasure. That's the number one problem. So,
Mm.
as opposed to focusing on both male and female pleasure and performance. So, that piece is one part. And then we have, men who come to me typically, like, for example, if they have like high blood pressure issues,
Mm-hmm.
chances are they're going to have erectile issues because of blood pressure medication. That has
Gotcha.
an impact.
Wow.
Weight, being overweight, that has an impact on erection. So, erectile dysfunction issues, I hate the word dysfunction, but erectile issues, uh, premature ejaculation as well.
Mm.
And sometimes some of those things is like mind over matter. And sometimes that's why I share that go to a doctor to rule out first to see if it is something that is biological. Then we can discuss whether or not. If it's not biological, then we know it's mental. Because I've
Gotcha.
had men who share that they actually masturbate and they can maintain and ejaculate, but with a partner they can't. So
Yeah.
that's, to me, that's a mental thing.
So, so diagnosing the mind over the body is really the first step.
Yeah.
And if there's certain conditions like high blood pressure, I know I had a client with diabetes, the same thing as well. Anything that's impacting blood flow,
Absolutely.
and obesity.
Yep.
Now, when we look at the show title, Marriage Underdogs, we find that a lot of couples are engaging in premarital sex by way of cohabitation.
Mhm.
And one of the statistics by way of the Pew Research Center reported that 60% of cohabitating couples will eventually get married. However, they also found that living together prior to marriage can increase your chances of getting divorced by as much as 40%. And I want to get your opinion on that data point, because what I find is usually the issues that couples bring in that kind of filter over from cohabitation into marriage are past transgressions that didn't get treated in the dating courtship phase. And all of a sudden, a man, or even the woman for that matter, might assume the marriage is the baptism that washes away the sins of infidelity. So you now have these issues around trust.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, or what do you see in terms of why cohabitation for long periods prior to marriage could be detrimental?
Yeah, for sure. So when things aren't made explicit and there isn't transparent conversation, is going to be a problem. That's it. Secondly, yes, I've heard that a million times over, that men share. And it's quite the contrary when she does it, but that's a whole other, I'm not going to touch that right now. But the thing is, it is kind of like, oh yeah, we married now. We wasn't married at the time. It's just blank slate. But the thing I tell people was, what was the commitment that we both agreed upon? Regardless, if the commitment or the agreed upon contract was to be monogamous, then that's the expectation. Now, if it was saying we're either going to be, because I work with all types of couples, polyamorous, polygamous, all types of couples. So if we signed up for that, then that's a different story. But if we signed up for monogamy, the expectation is we follow through with such a thing. And so that can cause some disruption in the relationship, and that gets carried over into the marriage. And I tell people that just because you get married, it doesn't wash things away. If anything, you're putting a magnifying glass to the problems that you have.
Definitely.
You know,
So
go
the
ahead.
marriage actually makes it brighter and shines a little bit deeper into the issue. It doesn't make it go away. Now, you mentioned polyamorous and different types of relationships. And in my work with couples, I don't have as much experience with those type of relationships. I've had some couples come in and they're in open relationships that do have defined boundaries. So I am aware of that, and I don't have any judgment. But I do wonder, if a person signs up for marriage and they seek to have additional partners within that marriage, is that their way of initially communicating, hey, I want to be with you, but I know myself to know I can't fully be satisfied with just you? Can you go a little bit deeper into that concept of why couples may seek to have multiple sex partners within the confine of a marriage? Because I'm just curious why they just don't get married and just continue to have multiple partners. And I'm just asking from, a curiosity perspective, right? No judgment.
Yeah, of course. So from what I know and research and working with these types of let's say they call them polycules. I've had a couple of those where I work with three at once, but it was just more or less what I've come to find is that it's a particular sexual orientation. And so a sexual orientation can be monogamous, a sexual orientation can be polygamous, polyamorous, open. So it's more of a choice. So this is kind of like, I've had people tell me like, hey, this whole term called monogamish, where it's kind of like I do have my main spouse or partner, but sometimes I may want energy from the opposite sex from time to time, whatever that means, whether it's sexual, whether it's me spending time with another person. But it could be, we could look at it as that, hey, maybe one person is not enough. We could look at it from that angle, and it could be looked at from another angle of this is just who I am. This is what but some people may beg to differ and feel that, it's impossible to invest all of yourself into more than one person. So that can be a thing too. I think it just depends on the person and how they operate within themselves and what makes them feel fulfilled and happy.
So it's more of a mindset then, right? And it's buyer's choice. I get that part. I'm just curious to wonder in your work if you see it kind of blow up on people, right? Because when I was initially beginning my training as a therapist with couples, I recall several cases where the male partner would introduce the female partner into additional relationships, and it almost backfired to where he let the cat out the bag and he couldn't get it back in there. And eventually those relationships dissolved because he wanted that female partner to no longer experience other people, but yet it was too late, right? So I think to your point, when both people or three people or four people or however many partners decide to come together, make the agreement and they establish the boundary.
Yep.
I feel like how do we manage, or I want to ask, how do we manage just human nature, right? Like being jealous or envious is something that could come about as a human. So how do those couples manage that? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, a big piece of it is communication. The biggest piece of it is communication and transparency. That's the biggest part. And I remember having a polycule some years ago, and one of the individuals had sex with someone else. For that person, it wasn't a problem that they had sex with this other person. The problem was that they didn't explicitly share that.
Now,
So
that makes sense.
So it's about open and honest communication. There's actually a group called the Progressive Love Academy that specializes in helping couples go from monogamous to polyamorous relationships. So she's a woman with two husbands. He's a husband with two wives, including each other. So they make it work, and so that's for them though. And they also help monogamous couples who just want to strengthen their relationship. But the way that I understand it is that, once you try to add people to a situation like that, is your initial relationship solid? Because then it's kind of like somebody used the analogy of broken cars. If my first car is broken, why am I going to add another car to it? I need to make sure that this car is straight. Then I can start adding some other cars to it if that's what I'm trying to do. But even on the other side, like both parties are in the same space. And so I think men who understand that are also open to women having multiple partners. But it's usually this one-sided thing where it's like, oh, I can, but no, you can't. No.
Right. And I think your point. So one of the pieces you said, the communication has to be there, and being open enough to acknowledge everybody's different.
Yeah.
There's certain people that have the mindset to be able to entertain multiple partners. I know myself personally, I could never do it. I know myself to know that, but I also don't judge others that do it. I actually somewhat have respect for people that can do that because it's a skill.
I can imagine.
To tame and to train your ego enough to allow someone to penetrate your partner, and you go do it too. I'm okay with that. I'll leave that aside, right?
It's not, I can imagine and it's kind of this concept of, this thing about monogamy, like when we get married, like we own each other, which we don't. We share each other. We choose to share each other. So I think that's the piece that they mention about this whole concept of ownership. So that's out the window. So that helps a little bit from what I've talked to them about to curb that whole, oh, they should just supposed to be with me type thing, and something my teacher said years ago that he believed that monogamy was a fallacy, not because it can't happen, but because people feel like they're obligated to be monogamous versus I want to be because this person inspires me so much. They're so amazing. I don't want anyone else. But if I ask a lot of these couples, is that how they feel? The majority of them will say no, unfortunately, at least in the circles in therapy. Now, outside of therapy, maybe it'll be a different response. That's what I want for. I want people to say that my partner is so amazing, I literally don't want anyone else.
And that ownership piece was really big, right? Because you want to make sure your partner has a level of differentiation. And when you think about them having the autonomy and anonymity to make their own decisions and choices, I have the decisions and choices to make. My wife does as well. We just ain't gonna make that decision with nobody else, right?
Absolutely.
Now I want to ask this question. This is out of curiosity, right? I haven't done any research on this, so anybody listening, don't put me to the fire. Is there any correlation between couples that engage in polyamorous or multiple partner relationships who may be victims or subject of past trauma? And I ask that question because a lot of the couples that I worked with that were in those type of relationships, they had sexual trauma or they were exposed to other types of trauma. And I just was curious if there was any correlation with that.
Well, I haven't seen that per se, but it's not to say that that couldn't exist. I know one type of person, she was just like, I'm just a freak. but that was her. So, but it's not to say that there isn't a correlation, because perhaps there could be some connection there to that. But the people, because in certain spaces, I know a lot of people who identify as, well, they'll say ethically non-monogamous, meaning that it's ethical in the sense that we're transparent, we know about these things with one another, etc. But it just depends on the person, the situation, you know. So perhaps I wouldn't rule out that there isn't any correlation, but no one so far and has shared that piece. But I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't.
No, I asked that question because there was a particular person in general I recall working with them, and she got cheated on by her husband, and they were together for like 12 years, monogamous, and all of a sudden he cheats. Now you have this open marriage. Like, so, you know, I see this transformation of, well, you hurt me, so I'm gonna now have, well, you open the floodgates.
Yeah.
We're gonna just continue to do that, right? So I do like what you were describing around communication. And, you know, I want to make sure too that we provide couples with tips that may be in a tough season. So if you're in a season of marriage and you're listening now, what can these partners do to turn the tide? Because you're not usually, for the most part, seeking your partner out sexually if you can't even be able to stand a conversation, or you don't want to be around them and you're just frustrated and you might be considering divorce. What can you give to those partners in that season now?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of it has to do with just choosing to have courageous conversations, as I like to call them, conversations that make you uncomfortable, but they are necessary to have. And I tell people it's like, it's analogous to gardening, right? This happens to be one of those gardens where both parties have to be inside of it. So we got to get our hands dirty. We might get cut, bruised, but we got to be in it together. That's the only way that's going to work. Because if one person is watching you tend the garden while the other one is actually working, it's still not going to work. So you know, yeah, yeah. So we often turn away from each other. They both have to make the choice to face each other and try to work through it. You know, because I know it's foggy, and a lot of people, I say, you just see the silhouette of each other. But it's like, can we start to walk closer together so we can see each other more clearly? And the reason why we even started this in the first place.
Definitely. I love your analogy of the garden, being in that garden together. And I'm sure you've experienced this as well in counseling, where one couple, or excuse me, one partner is choosing not to be in the garden.
Yep.
What do you tell that partner who's constantly picking up the shovel? They're getting cut, they're getting their hands dirty, they're playing seed, they're watering the grass, but that other partner is choosing not to even step in.
And then we need to reevaluate what we're doing there. And I've shared that with couples where one is in, one is out, and I can tell because there's no progress being made. So I said, either one or both of y'all don't want this, and so that's where I choose to meet. I remember one time distinctly years ago, this person, he's trying everything he can to make the marriage right, but then she's like, "There's no effort." So I had to meet with her by herself. I said, "Hey, what's the deal?" Because I'm trying to figure out. She said, "I don't know if I want to be in this no more." Yeah, that's pretty evident because you're not doing any of the work, you know. And so that is the thing where it's just kind of like, if the person is choosing not to do the work, then I have to make a different decision. No one wants to choose to have divorce as an option, you know, and at the same time, I can't do it by myself. It's impossible. It is impossible.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you shed light on that, because as a couples therapist, we can't do it by ourselves in terms of making one partner choose to be with you. We can't make that partner do the homework. We can't make that partner, using your analogy, get into the garden, right? So with that being said, the referral to individual counseling is what I tend to usually do at that point. And I make that referral because you have to figure out what you want for you, and then get to a position to make that decision quickly, because you have another person just being, you know, holding on by that string, and their anxieties are high, their emotions are high. They don't know what to do either. They're waiting on that other partner. You know, is that kind of your approach as well, to tell that person to go do some individual work and then come back to the table so you can communicate with everybody what you
definitely. And sometimes depending on couples, because some of the couples I have, they don't want to work with no other therapist. I had those kind of people like, I want you, you know. In certain cases I will refer out because I just feel like it's a better opportunity to do that versus doing a couples and be with me. But in certain cases, some people are able to differentiate, this is my individual time from my couple's time. So absolutely, so that we can practice, or with another therapist, having those different types of conversations, those courageous conversations that's efficient, that's productive, that's effective, so that we have some kind of resolve and understanding. Not agreeing, because that's two different things. I can understand you, but I don't have to agree with you.
I love your term, courageous conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And that needs to be what everybody is hearing today, right? Courageous conversations. Break that down a little bit more. I know it might be self-explanatory, but go into
Yeah,
it.
no, it's fine. Yes, but I got this from this book called The Woman Code by Sophia Nelson, and she talked about the whole chapter was on courageous conversations. But it's those types of conversations where you're kind of putting your neck out there, you're being vulnerable, you're expressing yourself about something someone did that may have hurt your feelings, but doing so in a way because it's vulnerable. You know what I mean? I'm not coming guns blazing, as I like to say. I'm not ripping your head off, but I'm coming in a very grounded, centered way. But I do want to express to you what I'm feeling, and what's happening with the hopes that we can resolve it. So it's a little uncomfortable, but instead of saying this is an argument or a disagreement, I'll just say we just had a courageous conversation.
Definitely. I love that term. And I'm just so glad that you were able to come on today. I always like every guest to share with our listeners how they can get in contact with you, any projects you have on the horizon. How can we support the work that you're doing?
Sure, I appreciate that. Definitely. And so as far as therapy services, it's a newcreationpsychotherapy.com. Instagram and Facebook is a new creation PSY. And then for my tantra work, it is the tantricmft.com. So that's more like the spiritual stuff. And then the Facebook and Instagram is the tantric MFT. Then Dr. Kukla, that's my speaking stuff, though, and supervision.
Awesome, man. You are a blessing to the field. I'm so glad that you decided to carve out a career in marriage and family therapy. And I hope to have you on again on the show. You just dropped so many dimes, so many nuggets. I'm sure the listeners were able to get so much value from what you shared with us today. And for those that are listening, I'm glad that you tuned in to Marriage Underdogs Radio Show podcast. And I am your host, Chris A. Matthews. And I look forward to joining you next time. Thank you.